Pittsburgh. I'm Zac Gibson, and this is Trib Lives from the Newsroom podcast, bringing you top stories from TribLive.com. On December 3rd, search crews in Unity began the search and rescue mission for 64-year-old Elizabeth Pollard, who disappeared late Monday night. Pollard was searching for her cat, Pepper, when she was last seen. After days of searching, authorities recovered her body from a sinkhole. Patrick Varine joins me today to give us the details of this recent tragedy. Thanks for coming, Patrick.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So tell me about how you were brought into this story. When did you first learn about the situation, and give me some background about your reporting process?
Sure. So last week I was working our 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. shift. That's the early reporter. That's the person who sort of does cleanup work for anything that has happened overnight, anything that happens after the night calls. Reporters get off at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock usually. And most mornings, it's pretty slow. Sometimes it'll be writing up a house fire, or if there's something that's maybe, snarling traffic on 28, that type of stuff. And on Monday morning, none of this had happened yet. I had been off work already by the time Miss Pollard had gone out to start looking for her cat. So the first that I came into contact with this was on Tuesday morning. I got up at 20 to 5, made my coffee, went downstairs, turned on the scanner, and I want to say probably around 6 or 6:30, I had heard a little bit of chatter on the scanner where they were talking about a search for a missing grandmother. And that by itself is not that unusual. The Pittsburgh police post regular things on their blotter about younger juveniles who go missing. And, a lot of times they're found within 24 hours. There are a lot of instances where we might not even necessarily write that story, or by the time somebody is getting ready to write that story, this person's already been found. By the time we got to the 8 o'clock editorial meeting, I had seen on our news partners website that they were going out to that scene. And that's usually indicative of something else going on. And when I heard the original call, I had reached out to the Westmoreland County 911 supervisor who was on duty. And he had just confirmed basically what they said on the scanner, like, oh, this is a search for a missing grandmother. Now, in retrospect, I wish that I had waited literally 2 more minutes before I called 911, because after the morning editorial meeting, I called 911 back, and the same supervisor, he answered, and he goes, oh, man, I wish you'd have called a couple minutes later, because he's like, 2 minutes after I hung up with you, I had to call the Bureau of Mine Safety. And so immediately then I was like, oh, okay, something else is going on here.
Interesting.
And so again, on Tuesday, I was just sort of barely involved, in a sense that I had sort of written up the bare basics of this, very early in the morning. I woke up on Wednesday morning to a note from my editor that said, we need you to go out to this sinkhole in Unity. Renata's been there all night. So then I realized, like, oh, no, okay, something very serious is happening. And so, I read over the stories, saw about the sinkhole. And so when I went out there, Renata was just finishing up her shift. One of our photographers, Louis Rudiger, was there, and he was getting ready to head out. And there is a very definite look that a reporter has on their face when they've unexpectedly worked an overnight shift.
Yes.
And, when I got out there, the folks who owned Monday's Union Restaurant, which is where the rear of this property is where that sinkhole opened up that Miss Pollard fell into, they were really, really awesome in essentially turning their restaurant over to the state police and the first responders to sort of serve as a home base. They had a couple of mobile command unit trailers out there, but like the one state policeman was telling me, like, you can only fit so many people in those. It's not a place where you can really like go to get warm.
Right.
And so Anita Iannuzzo, the owner of Mondays, was really, really awesome in providing a place, not just for the first responders, but they had a whole upstairs that they were able to sort of set up as a news conference area, as a place for media to stage, so we weren't all stuck in our cars in the cold. And that was where I sort of spent the rest of the week. I would get up in the morning, I would make my coffee, and then I would drive down to Unity. And I got to give, I don't know specifically, I think Marguerite Road, which is where the restaurant is, I think it's a state road. If it's a township road, then props to the Unity Township Public Works crew or whoever salted that road. Because the second morning I drove out there was the day that we got a decent bit of snow, the first bit of snow that stuck around. And I wasn't excited about that drive. I thought it was probably going to be not super great. And to be honest, like Marguerite Road was better and easier to drive on than Route 30. So, and you know, I mean, that could be because they probably knew that all of these people were going to be coming back down that road that day. But for whatever reason, that road was in excellent condition. So yeah, that was sort of where I would go there in the mornings. I would touch base with the state police to see if anything major had happened overnight. The night that Renata spent there overnight was the only time that that happened, because by the middle of the afternoon on Wednesday, I want to say, is kind of when things started to sort of switch from what they were referring to as a search and rescue to, unfortunately, what they were expecting to be kind of a recovery mission. And just to sort of set the scene in terms of what things kind of look like whenever we arrived there, by the second day, there was an excavator, there was a front loader. You know, the excavator was digging out around the area where they thought Miss Pollard had fallen. And as the excavator was piling tons and tons of dirt, this front loader would come over. And this, you know, this isn't something that I ever would have thought about at the time until I saw him doing it. And then it made perfect sense. You know, the excavator can just make piles and piles of dirt. And the front loader would go take a big scoop of that, move it someplace else so that he could keep piling, right? So he could just keep adding to that pile and it wouldn't get so big that it would tip over. Or actually, they were working kind of between the restaurant and the creek that was right there. And so I'm sure that they were trying as best as they could not to get any fill material like accidentally falling down into the creek.
Right.
So the front loader was kind of moving these piles of dirt all around throughout the course of the week. And as they shifted to working on a different area, you know, the excavator would sort of reposition itself. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, and I mean, it really probably is a testament to the folks who do that sort of search and rescue work. You know, the information that we had initially gotten was that Miss Pollard had fallen into a sinkhole, maybe fallen about 20 feet, but they weren't exactly sure because they hadn't gotten down there. You know, originally, the very first night, they had crews that were actually in the sinkhole digging by hand. And then I believe around the middle of the night on the first night, they determined that that was no longer safe to do. By the time I got there on Tuesday morning, they were no longer sending first responders down into that hole because it was just too dangerous.
Okay.
And so the way that it kind of proceeded from there was, like I said, this excavator was digging in and around where they thought, you know, could be areas adjacent to where Miss Pollard had fallen. And it's difficult for me as someone who's never operated heavy machinery to imagine like how careful you have to be during that, you know, but the state police told us, you know, like it looks like he's just taking big scoops of earth out. But I mean, really, this is a very surgical, you know, excavation. They're being very careful. You know, obviously, if they are digging close to where she is, you know, certainly they don't want to harm her.
Right.
And so by Wednesday, they were only working dawn to dusk. Wednesday, they made a lot of progress digging, couldn't find her. Same thing Thursday, they made decent progress. They also had, you know, some more information kind of about what they thought had happened.
Okay.
Originally, it kind of sounded as though Miss Pollard had fallen into a sinkhole into the mine. And ultimately, that's what happened, but it was a little more complicated than that. The way that it was explained to us, the sinkhole developed, like the mine, all the mine shafts themselves are somewhere between 25, 30 feet below ground.
Okay.
And the sinkhole that she initially fell into was above where these mines are. So what they think probably happened is, you know, over the course of, you know, the last time anybody did any serious work in this mine, there was some small bits of work done over the years, we found out, but the last time that this mine was like fully open and functional was like just a few years after World War II, you know, early 1950s at the latest.
Okay.
So over the course of the past 70, 75 years, the ground above it has been, for whatever reason, you know, slowly deteriorating. When we finally were able to look at the map that the search and rescue guys had put together, there were at least, I want to say, 5 different tunnels that sort of all kind of came together right near the area below this sinkhole.
Okay.
And they were speculating that, maybe that's why this sinkhole developed in the first place, is because so many of these tunnels kind of all joined together right in this area. But, this sinkhole had formed over time above the actual mine itself. And so what they said was, if you were to do like a cross section, what you would see is, the sinkhole at the top, and then sort of this big cone of earth. They sort of described it as sort of being like Hershey Kiss shaped.
Okay.
Where the land had deteriorated. The state police told us that they believe that where Miss Pollard fell into the sinkhole, there was maybe 4 to 5 inches of earth and grass there, and that's it. Mm-hmm. There was nothing underneath it, which like boggles my mind.
Right.
It's just crazy to think about. But they said the reason that they didn't find her directly below the sinkhole is because she probably hit this big cone of earth, rolled off in one direction or another, and then broke through the ceiling of the mine. And so, there are positive and negative aspects to that. Hitting this cone and rolling off means that maybe she didn't fall as far as they initially suspected.
Right.
But the other side of that is, she rolled off, punctured the ceiling of the mine, and now is even lower down than they thought maybe. So by the time, I want to say, and I was there till about 2 or 2:30, both Wednesday and Thursday, and
Okay.
then the night calls reporter came and relieved me. I want to say by the end of the day on Wednesday, they had already begun. There was a very small, like 1-story garage building that wasn't attached to the restaurant. It was sort of behind and to the right of the restaurant. And by the end of the day on Wednesday, they had started digging underneath that building.
Okay. Now, at this point on Wednesday, you say it went from more of a rescue mission to a recovery?
Yeah, and I don't remember. I don't think anybody said that on the record to me on Wednesday. I think that they started talking about that kind of at the press conference Wednesday afternoon.
Okay.
Because she fell into the hole sometime on Monday evening. So we're talking Monday night, Tuesday night, when we're talking almost going on between 50 and 72 hours, that she's been down there. They did mention that underground, even when it was super cold and snowy outside, the temperature is a little bit warmer. So, that was a positive that they could focus on. But, and again, I wasn't there at the press conference on Wednesday when they sort of talked a little bit more in detail about like why this is becoming a recovery effort. But I think it's just a matter of time elapsed and not seeing any, positive signs where they think that she might be. And, one of the wildest things about this to me is, I spent a lot of the first day, because there's a lot of waiting involved in this, from a reporter's perspective.
Right.
The state police and everybody who set up this scene, they did a very good job using the geography to their advantage. This 1-story building, even from where the media was staged in the upper floor of the restaurant with a back deck that we could go out and stand on, even with all of that as a vantage point, we still weren't able to see any of what they were doing. This 1-story building was kind of, in the perfect location where they could use the building and a couple of state police vehicles and a couple of construction vehicles to essentially block off the entire area.
Mm-hmm.
Because the last thing that they want is, not that any of us would exploit the situation like this, but like the last thing that they want is for them to be pulling this woman's body out of the ground and to have a camera right there.
Right.
And again, none of our photographers would ever take that picture and put it in the paper, but it's one of those things that the state police have to think about. So by the time Friday morning rolled around, they were, well, I guess even before Friday, they had excavated out enough that the excavator could kind of go down into the hole.
Okay.
to get better access. They were kind of coming up against the limits of where this excavator arm could get to.
Right.
And honestly, one of the things, especially after they talked about, what the situation sort of looked like underground, one of the things that I was going to ask and didn't get a chance to, because by the time I was getting ready to ask it, they had found Miss Pollard. I wanted to ask them, how did they know that it was all right for the excavator to be there? I
Right.
mean, I you hate to say it, but I kind of spent part of the week like crossing my fingers and hoping that I wasn't going to see like the excavator fall into this
Right.
hole, or this one-story building fall into this hole, or the restaurant where we were all, that's kind of when I finally found a map of the Marguerite Mine, which is a relatively small mine, but it is 48 acres. It's everywhere. It's under the whole neighborhood. And where that mine stops, another one starts. I mean, it's wild to think that 30 feet under everybody's house out there is this crazy tangle of tunnels that has not been maintained for almost 75 years. And I know, the DEP has gotten a lot of money, both from the state and the federal government, to try and mitigate that type of stuff.
Right.
Whether it's filling in those mines with grout or gravel or cement or whatever. But Pennsylvania is in a bad way with that. We have the most. I think we got the most federal money that was doled out in that big package of I think it was American Rescue Plan dollars, specifically to address abandoned mines. Because, like I said, back in the early 50s, whenever these coal companies, closed up shop, there was nobody around. I mean, there was maybe a rudimentary version of the DEP, but there was nobody around with any sort of enforcement teeth to be like, hey, man, clean this mine up and make sure it's not going to collapse in 50 years.
Right.
So that kind of stuff is just kind of all over. I was talking to a Murraysville fire chief from the Sardis Fire Company, and he had about a dozen or more of guys from his department who, when they were hand digging, were actually down there in the sinkhole. And he said, number one, it's one of the wildest situations that he's ever been a part of. But he also said, I can take you to a couple places in Murraysville right now where you can look down into a sinkhole and you can't see the bottom.
Wow.
That's crazy to me.
Yeah.
Our reporter, Megan Swift, did a story where she was talking to folks sort of in and around that neighborhood. And she talked to one guy who said, it's just something that, we grow up around. You'll be walking your dog and, off to the side, you'll see a circle of grass that's kind of sunken, and you just know not to go over there. It shouldn't be like that.
Agreed. So tell me about the actual recovery, which in your story it says early Friday.
Yeah, it was probably around 10:30 on Friday morning when, like I said, there's a lot of just sort of sitting around and waiting and observing that is involved in the reporting on this, because for the most part, until they find her, there's not much news to be had. They can talk a little bit about their process and what their tactics are. So anytime that any sort of like activity was happening on the site that wasn't just the excavator digging and the front loader, moving dirt around, people's ears would start to perk up. And about 10:30 on Friday morning, we started to notice that there were a lot more people moving around out in the parking lot.
Okay.
We got a call. I got a call or a message from Renata, who was listening on the scanner and had heard something on the scanner that indicated to her that they may have found Miss Pollard, which again dovetails perfectly with any sort of people hurrying around on the site. And in situations like this, where maybe somebody has passed, but you don't know for sure, my go-to is I'll text the county coroner, because he can't get super specific, but he can say, yes, my office has been called out to this site. So as soon as I got the message from Renata, texted the coroner, he texted me back in about 5 minutes. He said, yes, we've been called out there. That's the news. That means they found her, and she is not alive, unfortunately. And they found Miss Pollard's body, I want to say about 10 to 15 feet sort of southwest of where the sinkhole is, which is maybe not directly underneath the one-story garage, but in that area.
Okay.
And they set up a sort of a staging area that was completely covered so that they could bring her out, get her to the coroner, so the coroner could take her body for an autopsy. By the time they were getting ready to do a press conference, again, I was only working till 1:00 that week, so a lot of times I would just sort of be leaving in the middle of the afternoon when nobody knew sort of what the deal was. But they later that afternoon they did a press conference and made the official announcement and everything like that.
Okay. So after all of the action and excitement of this story had passed, there was a family that was left dealing with the death of a loved one. Through these stories, Trib Live reporters interviewed Tabitha Pollard, Elizabeth's niece, who spoke highly of Elizabeth's memory. Can you tell me about what Tabitha had to say?
Yes, absolutely. She described her aunt as a very loving woman. She had a husband, Kenny, and they both raised their granddaughter. Tabitha talked a little bit about how much Miss Pollard loved her granddaughter, doted on her all the time. As a matter of fact, her granddaughter was with her when she went to look for the cat. And that was one of the things that we were talking about earlier in the week. I don't remember much from when I was 5 years old, but like, it's wild to me that she had the presence of mind to stay in the car. If I was 5 years old and my grandma took me out, got out of the car in the dark, left, and didn't come back, I don't know what I would do. Like I said, she had the presence of mind to sit around, and probably that's the reason that she's safe today, because if she had even gotten out just to look in the immediate area for her grandma, there's a good chance that she would have fallen down that hole too. But yeah, Tabitha talked a lot about the relationship that the Miss Pollard and her granddaughter had. And this isn't the only time that this family has dealt with tragedy either. The last January, Miss Pollard had to deal with the death of her son Brandon, who was 28 years old at the time. And as the week sort of wore on, it was interesting to me. The family was not around the media, certainly very much, which I totally understand. If I was the family, I would not want to be either. But they were there at the site a fair bit, and they talked with the state police a good deal. And our contact with the state police was their spokesman, Trooper Steve Lamani, who was extraordinarily helpful all week. And as the week kind of goes on, you sort of start to see, a lot of times as reporters, you really only get to see like the official side of the state police. They're giving a press conference, they got the hat on with the chin strap, and like everything's very official. With something like this, where you're sitting around for days on end, you're waiting and hoping for good news, but kind of prepared to have bad news happen, you start to see a little more of the human side of somebody like a state police spokesman. He was saying before the press conference, but shortly after they had found Miss Pollard, he said, I hate to say that I'm relieved, to find somebody who's not alive, but he said, I really am, because, when they had the press conference to say that, like, this is probably a recovery effort now, obviously they've talked to the family beforehand and relayed that to them.
Yes.
And so, it's one thing to think about a family, like, kind of coming to terms with this, like we're probably not going to find our grandma alive. But to have, sort of accepted that, and then for them to not find her is even worse. Because then you just never know. We got some strange questions from readers during the course of the week. I guess maybe it's not strange, but really, and one of the guys from KDKA said this too, like, you can't imagine how many people asked us, but did they find the cat? But it's just one of those things, it's natural human curiosity. And that was a really strange aspect of the week. We're like, well, did they find the cat? Like, all right, I guess I'll go ask the state cops, but I don't think they found the cat,
Well, keeping in this vein of all of the conversations that happened after the announcement and with the loss in the family, the Pollards had two sons, Axel and Brandon. Brandon being the granddaughter's father. Throughout this process, we got to hear from Axel on the death of his mother, and he described his mother as kind, loving, and caring. In throughout the story, we see that he says she used to take them on vacation to Lancaster or Orlando sometimes. They didn't grow up with a lot of money, but she still made vacation happen. Hayes said that his mother taught him to take care of people and to put kindness out into the world. In a quote, he says that she taught him not to sit there and be afraid to stand up for himself. All of this just to color the way that his family is remembering Elizabeth now that she's gone. Now, throughout these and other conversations with the family, there are a lot of things that they have to deal with on top of just the grief of losing a loved one. And one of those things is addressing, now that it's such a public situation, they chose to address the entire situation as a family. Can you tell me a little bit about the statement that the Pollard family put out?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of it focused on, the efforts that all of these, volunteers and the state police and the excavating crew from Ligonier Construction put in, very long hours, even when they were only working dusk to dawn. The family statement, said, the state police might have felt that they failed us. And that's something that Lamani spoke to as well, especially on the day when things were sort of switching from search and rescue to recovery. He said that's something that starts to set in, at a certain, I forget what he said, 24 or 48 hour mark, something like that. You start to really like get down on yourself because like this is your job. Your job is, if someone's in danger, we help. And it doesn't always work out that way, but to their credit, that's not the way that the family viewed this at all. They're in their statement, they said, they didn't fail us. They did what they could do. They've been a big support to our family, keeping us updated with everything. We're very appreciative of the first responders, state police, anybody that was involved in the search, which is a very gracious thing, for them to say.
Absolutely. Now, in our last section, I want to go back to something that you said that really stuck out to me. Just in this area that we live in, sinkholes, well, mines are a very present reality. Now, should listeners in the Unity and surrounding areas, I know you mentioned Murraysville, should they be on the lookout or be more cautious now, particularly of sinkholes since this event? And what is being done with the actual sinkhole in this story near Monday's restaurant?
With the sinkhole in this story, I was out at Monday's Union yesterday because it was the first day that they had been back open. They aren't open on Mondays. And by the time I got there yesterday, almost all of the dirt that had been taken out of the hole had been put back in. So the area that they specifically excavated, they filled completely back in and were I mean, I don't know this for sure, but I assume, compacting the earth. I know Anita Iannuzzo, the owner at Monday, said that they had filled most of it in on Friday, but that when they came back to the site on Monday, again, like the earth, it had sunken a little. So, they put some more fill in there. But one of the things that we did during the first 24 hours was one of my editors looked back in our archives and put together a big list. If we wrote an article about a sinkhole, he gave me a link to it so I could look it up, see what the circumstances were. And the way that I would characterize mine sinkholes specifically is low frequency, high risk. Because the vast majority of sinkhole stories that we've written over the course of the past 5 years generally happen because of some sort of leaking liquid. Usually it's a water pipe or it's a sewage pipe.
Mm-hmm.
It's leaking liquid into the earth surrounding it, makes everything soft. Eventually that reaches the topsoil and you get a sinkhole. So it's much, much, much more common for a sinkhole to be related to that type of thing, whether it's a water main break or a sewage leak or that sort of thing. But there have been a handful of mine sinkholes that have opened up. What I do think people should be aware of is just how many of these mines there are. The way that I found a map of the Marguerite Mine, where this sinkhole opened up, is through the DEP's Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation website. They have a very good GIS map where you can, you start out looking at essentially a road map, and there are all of these pink lines that are everywhere, it seems like. And if you click on one, those are sort of delineating the borders of different mines. So if you click on an area, for example, if you click on, if you find where your house is, click on that map, it'll then give you a link to maps of the mines that are around. And like I said, this mine, the Marguerite Mine, is 48 acres. It's under a lot of the neighborhood, and it's one of the smaller mines. And again, like I said, where it stops, another one starts, especially out there. Westmoreland County has tons and tons and tons of mines, and some of that work extends to some extent into eastern Allegheny County too. I live in Holiday Park in Plum, almost next to Murraysville, and I went home and I pulled up that map immediately. As soon as I got home that day, I pulled it up. Because again, there are mines in Murraysville, and a lot of the work that we have written about related to mines is mostly centered on the water that comes out of them. A lot of these old abandoned mines essentially act as conduits for water to move around, and the water picks up heavy metals during the course of that. If you see a creek around here that is running with like orangish, cloudy water, that's sulfur in the water. If you see one around here that is running with sort of a cloudy Carolina blue color, that means that there's aluminum in the water. And a lot of the money goes towards, projects to clean that water. I don't think it's possible to stop it from discharging from the mines, but they can run it through a series of cleaning ponds, and they can make it much, much better, and they can make it possible for wildlife to live in it. We did a story about Brush Creek in Irwin about 10 years ago, which is full of sulfur, and where it runs orange, there ain't no fish.
Right.
There is nothing. And these projects, make that different. There are a lot of projects, and there's a couple in Murraysville that are looking to clean up mine water that is getting into Turtle Creek. And you can see, if you go down in Duff Park, there are sections where you can see the water has this milky blue color to it because it's got aluminum runoff in it. But yeah, I can't stress enough finding out whether or not there's a mine underneath your house. And I know that access to mine subsidence insurance is kind of a spotty thing. I know it's not available to everybody, even if there is maybe an abandoned mine under your house, but it's certainly something that's well worth checking into. Like I said, it's the one of the firefighters I talked to sort of characterized mine sinkholes as, again, like low frequency, high risk. Like, it doesn't happen often, but when it does, it can be a really big deal. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Patrick, thank you for coming on to bring all of this information and detailing the story for us.
Absolutely. And, for folks who are interested in finding out some more, or if you do see a depressed section of earth or a sinkhole open up, there is a number at the DEP where folks can call. 814-472-1800 is the environmental program manager, Roger Rummel of the DEP.
Okay.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this week's episode, share the podcast to help keep Western PA locally informed with insightful discussion and the latest news from your area. It's an easy way to spread the word, and it helps our podcast reach more people like you. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and turn on episode notifications so you never miss new content. Once again, I'm Zac Gibson, and this is From the Newsroom.